On February 14th, 1400, or shortly before, the former English King Richard II passed away. By that time, however, he was known simply as Sir Richard of Bordeaux. He had lost his crown just a few months earlier to his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who had since ascended the throne as King Henry IV. Almost immediately following Richard's death, rumours began circulating that Henry had orchestrated the former monarch's murder. To counter these accusations, Henry ordered Richard's body to be publicly displayed, intending to prove it bore no signs of harm. This attempt, however, did little to quell the rumours. On the contrary, speculation grew that Richard had been left to starve or die of thirst. From the very beginning, Richard's mysterious fate became a persistent challenge for the legitimacy of the Lancaster kings. Even Henry V, Henry IV's successor, had to contend with lingering doubts and theories about what had truly happened to Richard. In Henry V's case, rumours suggested the former king might still be alive. Faced with this growing speculation, Henry V resorted to a drastic measure. The details of this will be revealed at the end of this video. The most widespread account of Richard II's fate is found in the Brut Chronicles. For this discussion, I have used the text from Frederick W. D. Bree's 1908 edition and modernized it. According to the Chronicle, Richard was captured and brought to Henry Bolingbroke, the later Henry IV, who imprisoned him in the Tower of London. Shortly after, the lords of the realm, along with the common people, demanded Richard's deposition, citing his misrule and oppression. Stripped of his crown, he was moved to Pontefract Castle, where he later died, reportedly starved to death by his captors. Three key points stand out from this account. First, it clearly identifies the conflict between Henry and Richard as pivotal to Richard's death. Second, the description of his death is strikingly brief, merely noting that he was starved to death. Third, the chronicler explicitly refers to reports indicating a degree of uncertainty or reliance on second-hand information. We will revisit these aspects later, as there are other conflicting traditions. For now, however, let us examine the relationship between Henry and Richard, which for a long time was less adversarial and more one of shared fate. The two cousins had once been companions. They sheltered together in the Tower of London during the Peasants' Revolt. At the time, Henry's father, John of Gaunt, acted as the unofficial regent for Richard, who had ascended the throne at just 10 years old. Although Henry was among the lords who threatened Richard with deposition during the crisis of 1388, the two seemed to reconcile in subsequent years. Henry gained renown as a crusader, and Richard governed England with relative stability and competence. Moreover, tensions surrounding their competing claims to the throne appeared to have eased Henry, the son of Edward III's eldest surviving son, John of Gaunt, arguably had a stronger claim to the throne under the principles of primogeniture. Richard, however, was the son of the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, who had predeceased Edward III. Richard also had an older brother, but he had died young. Even contemporary legal scholars struggled to resolve the succession question definitively. Ultimately, it was Edward III's decision that secured Richard's position. Edward III likely envisioned John of Gaunt serving as regent until Richard came of age, but Parliament distrusted John and immediately declared Richard of age. As a result, John governed informally, leading to years of uncertainty over who truly wielded power. Nonetheless, John never openly rebelled against Richard, and Henry remained loyal until Richard's demand for exorbitant taxes in the 1380s, ostensibly for defense, caused tensions to flare. After this period of strife, the situation stabilized. Historians like Dan Jones attribute this to the influence of Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia. However, Anne's death on June 7, 1394, marked a turning point. While Richard remarried the young French Princess Isabella, known as the Little Queen, her age precluded her from providing a similar stabilizing influence. In the years that followed, Richard grew increasingly paranoid and vengeful toward those who had humiliated him. Henry was a prime target of this obsession, especially after the example of Thomas of Gloucester, Richard's uncle, who Richard imprisoned and murdered in Calais. The opportunity to act against Henry arose in 1398 when Thomas de Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, made remarks about Richard's rule that Henry interpreted as treason. Henry reported these comments to the king, prompting a heated dispute. A judicial duel was arranged to resolve the matter, but Richard intervened before it began. Despite having sanctioned it, Richard exiled de Mowbray for life and banished Henry for 10 years. John of Gaunt agreed to this decision, and Henry was allowed to appoint a lawyer to manage his estates in England. Henry himself found a warm reception at the French court, however. Just 3 months later, John of Gaunt died. By rights, Henry's lawyer should have been permitted to claim his father's inheritance, but Richard intervened. He revoked the lawyer's authority, extended Henry's exile to 20 years, and seized the inheritance for himself. This action provoked significant discontent among the English nobility, though no one dared to challenge Richard outright. By this time, Richard had begun building a private army, easily identifiable by their emblem, the White Hart. These forces enabled him to coerce the nobility into providing him with blank charters, sealed but otherwise empty documents that allowed the king to insert any content he desired. This tactic granted Richard the power to destroy his enemies under the guise of legality. The last years of Richard's reign are often described as tyrannical, with the use of blank charters serving as a key example. This oppressive governance further alienated the nobility and set the stage for his downfall. Richard then made a decisive mistake. When riots broke out in Ireland, the king decided to personally lead the effort to suppress the unrest. Before leaving, he appointed his uncle, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, as regent. Unfortunately, the details of what followed are mostly derived from later sources that sought to legitimize the new Lancaster regime. Henry, meanwhile, decided to return to England to officially claim his inheritance. However, it was clear that he intended to go beyond this and seize the crown. Accompanied by a mere 60 followers, Henry is said to have docked at several points along the English coast to gauge public sentiment toward him. Apparently encouraged by the response, he finally landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire. Remarkably, the great nobles of England quickly rallied to his cause, including many who had previously been loyal to Richard. Among them was the Duke of York, who deemed resistance futile. York even traveled to Windsor with Richard's wife to protect her from any acts of vengeance intended for her husband. Beyond this, York offered no resistance, fully submitting to Henry's authority. Faced with the overwhelming support Henry had garnered, Richard's White Hart army dissolved at the sight of the united English nobility. In the meantime, Richard received news of these developments while still in Ireland. He rushed back to England, but by the time he arrived, the situation was beyond salvage. Completely isolated, Richard dismissed his remaining army, or more likely, his troops defected to Henry. This interpretation aligns with an excerpt from the Brut Chronicles, which I have modernized. Hearing of their return, King Richard hastily abandoned his plans in Ireland and returned to England, seeking refuge at Flint Castle. However, his supporters deserted him, including Sir Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester, who symbolically broke the king's staff of office, leaving Richard isolated. Bolingbroke, now commanding a significant force, moved southward, capturing Richard's allies and executing those he deemed guilty of greed and betrayal. At this point, Richard sought refuge in Flint Castle, while Henry camped nearby at Conway Castle. Henry besieged Flint and sent negotiators to parley with Richard. Accounts differ as to whether their eventual meeting took place at Flint or Conway, but they do agree on its content. According to propagandistic sources, the meeting began with Henry addressing Richard, who had assured him of a welcome reception. "My sovereign lord and king, the cause of my coming at this time is to have again the restitution of my person, my lands, and my heritage through your majesty's gracious permission." Richard reportedly replied, "Dear cousin, I am ready to accomplish your will, so that you may enjoy all that is yours without exception." Richard then inquired about the large army outside the castle, asking what the soldiers wanted. Henry responded that they demanded he arrest Richard and take him to the Tower of London as a prisoner. According to Henry, this was the only way to satisfy the troops. Richard complied. During the journey to London, Richard may have been subjected to mistreatment. Jacob Abbott, a 19th century author, describes marks of neglect and indignity suffered by the king, though he does not provide a source for this claim. In London, Henry convened a parliament, officially in Richard's name, as Henry himself lacked the authority to summon it. This parliament drafted 33 formal charges against Richard. Confined to the royal apartments in the Tower, Richard reportedly learned of these proceedings only through hearsay. His mental state is said to have swung between fits of rage, profound depression, and brooding despair. He frequently vowed revenge, but his situation was beyond recovery. At last, the time came to bring Richard's reign to an end. Henry, accompanied by the Duke of York and several other nobles, went to the Tower of London, where they were said to have demanded that the king come before them to learn his fate. Richard reportedly responded, "Tell Henry of Lancaster that I shall do no such thing. If he wishes to see me, let him come to me." Henry and the other nobles acquiesced, bowing as they approached Richard. However, the meeting quickly turned volatile. Upon seeing the Duke of York, Richard flew into a frenzy and physically attacked his uncle. The two men had to be separated. Turning to Henry, Richard demanded an explanation for his treatment, asking whether he was Henry's king or his servant. Henry replied that Richard was indeed his king, but added that Parliament had decided to confine him to his chambers until a verdict was reached on the charges against him. This answer reportedly sent Richard into another tantrum, which only worsened when Henry denied his request to see his wife. Henry then conveyed Parliament's demand for Richard's abdication. At first, Richard staunchly refused, but eventually relented, agreeing to abdicate in order to save his life. This fateful decision occurred on September 29, 1399. The following day, Parliament formally nominated Henry as Richard's successor. To avoid any period without a monarch, the official deposition was recorded on October 1st. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 13th, 1399, the feast day of Edward the Confessor, Henry was crowned King Henry IV. Meanwhile, Richard had been taken to his final residence, Pontefract Castle. He was housed in rooms within the Gascoigne Tower, though accounts differ as to whether he died there or in the keep of the castle. The circumstances of his death remain shrouded in uncertainty. Pontefract Castle was an intriguing choice as Richard's place of imprisonment, not only for its strategic security, but also for its symbolic significance. The fortress was part of Henry's inheritance from his mother, Blanche of Lancaster. 3 generations earlier, Edward II had executed Thomas of Lancaster, Blanche's great-uncle, at this very site after a show trial. By imprisoning another deposed king here, Henry sent a clear and ominous message. Richard could not be certain of his survival. The exact timing of the decision to end Richard's life remains unclear. Allegedly, there were several plots against Henry's life, including the discovery of an object studded with sharp thorns in his bed. Eventually, a full-scale revolt, the Epiphany Uprising, sought to restore Richard to the throne. The failure of this rebellion sealed Richard's fate. English chroniclers largely agree that Richard was left to die of hunger and thirst, whereas French chroniclers suggest he was violently murdered. William Shakespeare likely drew from these French accounts when he penned these lines for Anthony Earl Rivers in Richard III. "O Pomfret, Pomfret, O thou bloody prison, fatal and ominous to noble peers! Within the guilty closure of thy walls, Richard II here was hacked to death." However, the events surrounding Richard's death make this scenario unlikely. To counter speculation, Henry had Richard's body laid out in Old St. Paul's Cathedral for 3 days to demonstrate that he had not died by violence. While some injuries might be concealed, the dismemberment described by Shakespeare would almost certainly have been evident. Henry originally intended for Richard's young wife, Isabella, to remain in England. However, she rejected multiple proposals for her future and was ultimately allowed to return to France. There, she remarried at 19, gave birth to a son 3 years later, and tragically died in childbirth. Richard's death sparked persistent rumours about his survival. Scottish sources claimed that he had escaped from Pontefract and found refuge at the court of King Robert and his regent Albany. Allegedly, he lived in Scotland until 1419, dying in Stirling that year. Contemporary accounts from outside Scotland also mention a man in the country claiming to be Richard II. However, these descriptions often align with what would today be considered symptoms of mental illness. It was likely this impostor that prompted Henry V to take an intriguing step in 1413. The false Richard had repeatedly served as a rallying point for opposition against the Lancaster kings. To address this, Henry V officially declared that his father, Henry IV, had erred in having Richard buried at King's Langley shortly after his death. Henry V pledged to rectify this mistake. To this day, many interpret Henry V's statement as an implicit admission that Richard's death was indeed a murder and that his father bore responsibility. I share this view. As a result, Richard's remains were transferred to Westminster Abbey, where he had arranged for his tomb to be constructed beside that of his first wife in 1395. The public procession underscored the fact that Richard was indeed dead, while Henry V sought to mollify Richard's lingering supporters, who had long been aggrieved by the treatment of the late monarch. Richard II had meticulously designed his tomb, down to the gravestone inscription, which offers a rare glimpse into his mindset. The epitaph, translated into English, reads, "Prudent and worldly wise Richard, rightly II, conquered by fate, lies here beneath this painted marble. Truthful in speech and full of reason, tall in body, wise in spirit like Homer. He supported the church and humbled the proud. He overthrew anyone who violated royal authority. He crushed heretics and vanquished their allies. O merciful Christ, to whom this man was devoted, through the prayers of the Baptist, save the one he held above all others." Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.